The cattle auction in Millbrook County had seen its share of heartbreak, but nothing quite like what unfolded on that scorching Tuesday in August 1987. When the auctioneer's hammer fell on lot number 47, most folks figured they were witnessing just another sad transaction in a long line of them. They had no idea they were about to witness the beginning of something that would become legend in 3 counties. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust hadn't settled from the morning's first sales when Ezra Blackwood pulled his weathered Chevy pickup into the auction yard. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd learned that life's hardest lessons often came wrapped in its most ordinary moments. The Wyoming sun had carved deep lines around his gray eyes, and his calloused hands told the story of 30 years working the Broken Arrow Ranch that stretched across 8,000 acres of some of the most unforgiving land God ever created. Ezra hadn't planned on coming to the auction that day. Hell, he hadn't planned on much of anything since Sarah died 6 months earlier. The cancer had taken her quickly, leaving him alone in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. There, 2 children lived states away, Marcus in California, chasing his dreams in Silicon Valley, and Rebecca raising her own family in North Carolina. They called regularly, worried about their father living alone on the ranch, but Ezra insisted he was managing just fine. The truth was messier than that since Sarah's passing. The Broken Arrow had become more of a burden than blessing. The hired hands still showed up, did their work, and collected their pay. But Ezra found himself going through the motions without the passion that had once driven him to build one of the most respected cattle operations in the region. He'd come to the auction looking for breeding stock, hoping that maybe investing in new animals might rekindle some spark of purpose. The morning sales had been routine, mostly young bulls and prime heifers changing hands between familiar faces. Ezra bid on a few lots but got outbid each time by ranchers with deeper pockets or more desperate needs. He was about to head home when he noticed the commotion near the holding pens. A small crowd had gathered around pen 47, their voices carrying a mix of disgust and pity. Ezra made his way over, his curiosity getting the better of him. What he saw made his stomach turn and his heart break in equal measure. Standing in the corner of the pen was a Holstein cow that looked like she'd been through hell and back. She was grossly overweight, her black and white coat matted with mud and worse. But it was her condition that made grown men turn away. She was heavily pregnant and bleeding from what appeared to be infected wounds on her flanks. Her eyes held a look that Ezra had seen too many times in his life, the hollow stare of a creature that had given up hope. "Jesus Christ," muttered Tom Henderson, a local rancher who'd known Ezra for 20 years. "Who the hell lets an animal get to this state?" "That'd be Jimmy Crawdad," said another voice. Ezra turned to see Bill Hutchins, the auction yard's head veterinarian, approaching the group. "Brought her this morning. Says he needs quick cash for..." Well, let's just say his priorities ain't exactly livestock care. Jimmy Crawdad was known throughout the county as a man who'd sell his own shadow, if he could figure out how to catch it. He ran a pathetic excuse for a farm about 30 miles south, and everyone knew his primary crop was the corn mash he fermented in his barn. The local sheriff had raided the place twice in the past year, but Jimmy always seemed to slither out of serious trouble. "What's wrong with her?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew. Bill shook his head grimly. "Near as I can tell, she's been bred repeatedly without proper care. Those wounds look like they're from barbed wire, probably trying to get to food or water. She's malnourished despite her size that's mostly bloat and the calf she's carrying. I guess she's got maybe 2 weeks before she gives birth, assuming she makes it that long. And Jimmy's selling her anyway? Claims he needs the money for essential supplies," Bill said, making air quotes. "We all know what that means. I tried to get the county to step in, but legally, She's his property until someone else buys her. The auctioneer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, announcing that Lot 47 would be up next. Ezra watched as most of the crowd began to disperse. No serious rancher would bid on an animal in this condition. The smart money said she'd either go for slaughter price to whoever ran the local rendering plant, or Jimmy would end up taking her home unsold. As the group thinned out, Ezra found himself alone at the pen. The cow had moved slightly, and he could see her better now. Despite her terrible condition, there was something about her that reminded him of Bessie, the first cow he and Sarah had bought when they started the Broken Arrow 30 years ago. It wasn't the breed, Bessie had been a Hereford, but something in the eyes. An intelligence that hadn't been completely extinguished despite everything she'd endured. "Are you thinking of bidding on her?" Ezra turned to find Margaret Chun, the auction yard's office manager, standing beside him. Margaret had been running the administrative side of the Millbrook County Livestock Auction for 15 years, and she'd seen every kind of heartbreak the business had to offer. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to business, but also for her genuine care for both the animals and the people who depended on them. "Honestly, I don't know what I'm thinking," Ezra admitted. "She's in rough shape. That's putting it kindly," Margaret said. "Bill thinks she might not make it through the birth. And even if she does, the recovery would be long and expensive. You'd be looking at months of veterinary bills with no guarantee of success." Ezra nodded, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way the cow occasionally lifted her head to look at him, as if she was trying to communicate something. Maybe it was the memory of Sarah's voice echoing in his head, reminding him that sometimes the most broken things just needed someone to believe they were worth saving. "What would you guess she go for?" he asked. Margaret consulted her clipboard. "In this condition, probably slaughter price. Maybe $300–400. Jimmy owes money all over the county, so he'll take whatever he can get." The auctioneer's voice boomed across the yard again, calling for Lot 47 to be brought to the sales ring. Ezra watched as two workers prodded the cow out of the pen. She moved slowly, obviously in pain, but she didn't fight them. It was as if she'd accepted whatever fate awaited her. In the sales ring, the cow looked even worse under the bright lights. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Randy Pike, who'd been calling sales in Wyoming for 25 years, took one look at the animal and couldn't quite hide his distaste. "All right, folks, we've got a lot of 47 here," Randy announced, his usual enthusiasm notably diminished. "Holstein cow, bred, due soon according to the seller. Let's start the bidding at let's say $200. Silence filled the auction barn. Even the regular chatter among the bidders died down as people either looked away or stared with morbid curiosity. Ezra found himself sitting forward in his seat, though he wasn't sure why. "Come on, folks, somebody give." "Me 200, Randy tried again. "She's got potential once she's cleaned up." More silence. Ezra could see Jimmy Crawdad sitting in the back row, nervously chewing on a toothpick. The man looked desperate, and desperation had a smell that every regular at the auction could recognize from 50 yards away. "All right, let's try 150. Randy said, his voice losing its practiced polish. $150 for a bred cow. Come on, that's just the cost of feeding her for a few months." A hand went up in the back. Ezra craned his neck to see who it was. Harold Bixby, who ran the rendering operation over in Casper. If Harold bought her, the cow would be dead within the hour, processed into dog food and industrial products. It was a fate that awaited many animals at these auctions, but somehow this one felt different. "I've got 150 from Harold," Randy called out. "Do I hear 175? Ezra's hand moved before his brain could stop it. 175 to the gentleman in Section C. Randy announced, sounding surprised that anyone had outbid the renderer. "Do I hear 200? Harold glanced around, saw Ezra, and shook his head. He'd been in the rendering business long enough to know when someone was bidding with their heart instead of their head. No point in getting into a bidding war over one sick cow when there'd be plenty of other opportunities. 175 going once, Randy called out. Going twice ... Ezra felt his heart pounding. He had no idea what he was doing. The rational part of his mind was screaming that this was a mistake, that he was about to spend money on an animal that would likely die within days. But another part of him, a part that sounded suspiciously like Sarah's voice, was telling him that sometimes doing the right thing didn't make financial sense. Sold to bidder number 28 for $175. The hammer fell, and Ezra realized he'd just bought himself a world of trouble. As the crowd began to disperse and move on to the next lot, he made his way down to the office to complete the paperwork. Margaret gave him a look that was equal parts sympathy and concern. "You sure about this, Ezra?" she asked as she processed the sale. "I've seen good ranchers go broke trying to save animals that couldn't be saved." "Probably not," Ezra admitted, signing the papers. "But I reckon I've done stupider things in my life." As he walked back toward the holding area to arrange transport for his new acquisition, Ezra passed Jimmy Crawdad heading toward the parking lot. The man reeked of stale alcohol and poor decisions, and he was counting a small roll of bills with the intensity of someone who just received a life-saving reprieve. "Appreciate the business," Jimmy said with a gap-toothed grin. "You got yourself a real bargain there. That cow's got good bloodlines, she does." Ezra stopped walking. "Bloodlines?" "Oh yeah," Jimmy continued, apparently misreading Ezra's expression, as enthusiasm rather than barely controlled anger. "Her mama was one of the best milkers in the 3 counties. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Of course, this one never got the chance to show what she could do, what with all the breeding and such. But the genetics are there, yes sir. How long have you had her?" "About 3 years now. Bought her as a heifer from the Morrison place when they went under. Had big plans for her, I did." Jimmy's eyes took on a distant look, as if he was remembering a version of himself that had once harbored good intentions. "But you know how it is. Life gets in the way, and sometimes you gotta make hard choices." Ezra looked at the man, really looked at him, and saw something he recognized. It was the same hollow desperation he'd been fighting off since Sarah died. The difference was that Jimmy had been drowning in it for years, making one destructive choice after another until he'd become something barely recognizable as human. "What's her name?" Ezra asked. Jimmy looked confused. "Name? Hell, I just called her Cow. Never saw much point in naming livestock you're just gonna sell or slaughter." That answer told Ezra everything he needed to know about the kind of life the animal had been living. He nodded curtly to Jimmy and continued toward the holding pens, leaving the man to count his blood money in peace. By the time Ezra reached the pen, Bill Hutchins was already there with his medical kit, doing a more thorough examination of the cow than had been possible during the chaos of the pre-sale inspection. "Well, the good news is she's not as bad off as she looks," Bill said without looking up from his work. "The bad news is she's still pretty damn bad off." "Give it to me straight, Doc." Bill straightened up and wiped his hands on a towel. "She's severely malnourished, probably hasn't had decent feed in months. Those wounds are infected but treatable. The biggest concern is the calf she's carrying. She's further along than I initially thought. I'd say she's got maybe a week, 10 days at most before she gives birth. And her chances? If she was a younger animal in better condition, I'd say 50-50 for both mother and calf. As it stands," Bill shrugged, "maybe 30% for her, 20 for the baby. Those aren't betting odds, Ezra." Ezra looked at the cow, who had turned her massive head to watch their conversation. Her eyes, despite everything she'd endured, held an alertness that surprised him. It was as if she understood that her fate had just changed hands, and she was trying to figure out what that meant, What would you do? Ezra asked. Bill was quiet for a long moment. As a veterinarian? I'd tell you to cut your losses. Put her down humanely and chalk it up to a charitable gesture. He paused, then continued, more quietly. As someone who's known you for 15 years and watched you build the Broken Arrow into something special, I'd say that sometimes the animals that need saving the most are the ones that save us right back. The loading of the cow onto Ezra's trailer was a delicate operation that required the help of 3 auction yard workers and a liberal application of patience. She moved slowly, clearly in pain, but she didn't fight the process. It was as if she understood that wherever she was going had to be better than where she'd been. As Ezra drove the 30-mile journey back to Broken Arrow, he found himself talking to the cow through the open window of his truck cab. It was something Sarah used to tease him about, his habit of carrying on one-sided conversations with his animals as if they were old friends sharing gossip over coffee. I don't know what the hell I'm doing here, he admitted as they bounced along the county road. Haven't made a lot of smart decisions lately, but I figure you deserve a chance to see what life looks like when somebody gives a damn about you. The cow didn't respond, of course, but Ezra could swear he heard her shift positions in the trailer, as if she was trying to get more comfortable for the ride. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. The Broken Arrow Ranch appeared in the distance as they crested Miller's Hill, its buildings sprawling across the valley like a small town. The main house, built from local stone and timber that Ezra and Sarah had selected themselves, stood at the center of the operation. Around it, various barns, corrals, and outbuildings created a functional layout that had evolved over 3 decades of trial and error. As they pulled into the main yard, Ezra's hired hands emerged from various buildings to see what their boss had brought home. There was Carlos Mendoza, the ranch foreman who'd been with the Broken Arrow for 12 years and knew the operation better than anyone except Ezra himself. Next to him stood Luke Peterson, a young cowboy from Montana who'd signed on 6 months earlier and was still proving himself. Bringing up the rear was old Pete Kowalski, whose official title was General Maintenance, but who actually served as the ranch's unofficial philosopher and voice of hard-earned wisdom. The look on their faces when Ezra opened the trailer told him everything he needed to know about his purchase. Carlos actually removed his hat and ran his hand through his gray hair, a gesture that usually preceded a very diplomatic lecture about ranch economics. "Boss," Carlos said carefully, "please tell me you didn't pay actual money for that cow." $1.75, Ezra admitted. Luke let out a low whistle. "For a cow that looks like she's already got 1 foot in the grave?" 2 feet, old Pete corrected. "Maybe 3. Despite the criticism, all 3 men moved to help unload the cow and get her settled in the quarantine pen that Bill Hutchins had insisted on during their phone call on the drive home. They might not understand their boss's decision, but they'd follow his lead just like they had through everything else over the years. Getting the cow into the pen required more patience and gentle coaxing. She moved like every step caused her pain, which it probably did. But once she was inside the enclosure, something interesting happened. She walked directly to the water trough and began drinking, not the desperate gulping of a dehydrated animal, but the steady, measured drinking of a cow who finally felt safe enough to tend to her own needs. "Well, I'll be damned," old Pete muttered. "Look at that. She knows she's home." Ezra watched as the cow finished drinking and then moved to the hay feeder. She sniffed the fresh Timothy hay for a moment before beginning to eat, with the same deliberate care she'd shown with the water. It was the behavior of an animal who'd learned not to take good things for granted. "What are you going to call her?" Luke asked. The question caught Ezra off guard. In all his worried planning about veterinary care and recovery, he hadn't thought about something as basic as a name. He studied the cow as she continued to eat, noting the way she kept one eye on the humans watching her while still focusing on the food. There was a dignity to her movements despite her condition, a quiet strength. That reminded him of Grace, he said suddenly. Her name is Grace. Carlos raised an eyebrow. Grace? That's actually a pretty good name for her. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Sarah had always loved, Ezra found himself standing alone at the fence of Grace's pen. She had finished eating and was now lying down in the clean straw, her massive bulk settling with obvious relief. For the first time in 6 months, Ezra felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. He didn't know if Grace would survive the birth, or if her calf would make it, or if he'd just spent money he couldn't afford on a lost cause. But for the first time since Sarah's funeral, he had something to care about besides his own grief. Grace lifted her head and looked at him across the pen. In the fading light, her eyes seemed clearer than they had at the auction, as if the simple act of being cared for had already begun to work some small miracle. "We'll figure this out together," Ezra said quietly. "Both of us have been through hell lately. Maybe it's time we helped each other find our way back." The cow didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. And in that moment, as the first stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, both the broken-hearted rancher and the bleeding mother cow began the slow process of learning to hope again. The first crisis came 3 days after Grace arrived at the Broken Arrow. Ezra was finishing his morning coffee when Carlos burst through the kitchen door, his usual calm demeanor replaced by urgent concern. "Boss, you need to come quick. Something's wrong with Grace." Ezra grabbed his boots and followed Carlos across the yard to the quarantine pen. What he saw made his blood run cold. Grace was down on her side, her breathing labored and her eyes rolled back. A thick, dark discharge pooled beneath her, and her entire body shook with tremors that looked like seizures. "How long has she been like this?" Ezra demanded. "Found her maybe 10 minutes ago. Luke's already called Doc Hutchins. He should be here any minute." Ezra climbed into the pen, despite Carlos's protests about safety. Grace was barely conscious, but when she felt his hand on her neck, her eyes focused on him with what looked like recognition. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, each breath a struggle that seemed to take enormous effort. "Easy, girl," Ezra murmured, his voice steady despite the panic building in his chest. "Doc's coming. We're not giving up on you." Bill Hutchins arrived 15 minutes later, his truck kicking up a cloud of dust as he raced into the yard. He took one look at Grace and immediately began pulling equipment from his veterinary kit. "Toxemia," he said grimly, checking her vital signs. "Her system's been poisoned by the pregnancy. Probably been building for weeks, but the stress of the move and change in diet triggered the crisis. Can you save her?" Bill didn't answer immediately, which told Ezra everything he needed to know. The veterinarian worked quickly, administering injections and setting up in 4-line. Grace barely responded to the needle sticks, which was either a blessing or a very bad sign. "The calf's in distress too," Bill said after listening to Grace's abdomen with his stethoscope. "Heart rate's erratic. We're looking at a situation where we might lose both of them, or we might have to choose. Choose? Emergency cesarean. Take the calf now and hope Grace survives the surgery, or try to stabilize her and risk losing the baby." Bill's hands never stopped moving as he spoke, adjusting 4 drips and checking responses. In her weakened condition, surgery could kill her. But if we wait, the toxemia could take them both. Ezra stared down at Grace, who had quieted somewhat since Bill's arrival. Her eyes were clearer now, and she was watching him with an intensity that seemed almost human. It was as if she was trying to tell him something, to communicate some decision that only she could make. "What would you do if she was yours?" Ezra asked. Bill paused in his work. "Honestly, I'd probably recommend putting her down. She's suffered enough, and the kindest thing might be to end it peacefully." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. 3 days ago, He'd saved Grace from certain death at the rendering plant, and now he was facing the same decision all over again. But something had changed in those 3 days. Grace wasn't just another cow anymore. She'd become a symbol of something larger, a chance for both of them to prove that broken things could be made whole again. "No," Ezra said firmly. "We will try the surgery. If she doesn't make it, at least she knows somebody fought for her." Bill nodded, though his expression remained grim. "All right, but we need to do it here now. She's too weak to transport, and we can't wait any longer." What followed was the most intense 3 hours of Ezra's life since Sarah's final day in the hospital. Bill worked with the focused intensity of a battlefield surgeon, while Ezra, Carlos, and Luke assisted however they could. They converted the quarantine pen into an operating room, rigging lights and creating a sterile field as best they could under the circumstances. Grace remained conscious throughout the procedure, too weak to struggle but aware enough to track Ezra's movements with her eyes. He stayed by her head, talking to her in the same gentle voice he'd once used to comfort Sarah during her worst days of chemotherapy. "You're doing great, girl. Just a little longer now. Doc knows what he's doing." When Bill finally announced that he'd successfully delivered the calf, a collective cheer went up from the small group. But the celebration was short-lived. The baby, a small heifer with Grace's distinctive black and white markings, wasn't breathing. Luke immediately began working on the calf, clearing its airways and stimulating its breathing while Bill focused on closing Grace's incision. For several agonizing minutes, it looked like they might save the mother only to lose the baby. Then, suddenly, the calf took a gasping breath, followed by another and another. Within minutes, she was breathing steadily. On her own, though she was clearly weak and would need constant monitoring. "2 miracles in 1 day, old Pete observed, speaking for everyone who'd witnessed the drama. "That's got to be some kind of record." The recovery period that followed tested everyone's patience and endurance. Grace remained weak for days, requiring round-the-clock care that included regular medication, frequent feeding, and constant monitoring. The calf, whom Ezra named Hope, needed bottle feeding every few hours since Grace wasn't producing enough milk in her weakened state. Ezra found himself spending most of his time in the barn, sleeping on a cot he'd set up near Grace's stall. His hired hands initially tried to convince him to let them handle the night shifts, but Ezra insisted on being there himself. Something about Grace's ordeal had awakened a protective instinct in him that he hadn't felt since his children were small. During those long nights, Ezra found himself talking to Grace about everything: Sarah's illness, his struggles with loneliness, his fears about the future of the ranch. Grace would listen with what seemed like genuine attention, occasionally responding with soft lows or gentle movements that felt like encouragement. "You know, Sarah would have loved you," he told Grace one night as he adjusted her blanket. "She had a thing for underdogs, creatures that everybody else had given up on. She used to say that the most beautiful things in life were the ones that had to fight to become beautiful." Grace turned her massive head to look at him, and Ezra could swear he saw understanding in her dark eyes. It was a crazy thought, attributing human emotions to a cow, but Grace seemed different from other cattle he'd known. There was an intelligence there, a depth of feeling that went beyond simple animal instinct. The turning point came 2 weeks after the surgery. Ezra arrived at the barn for his morning check to find Grace standing upright for the first time since the operation. She was still weak, moving carefully, but there was an alertness in her posture that hadn't been there before. "Well, look who's feeling better," Ezra said, unable to keep the smile out of his voice. Grace responded by walking slowly to the water trough, drinking deeply before moving to the hay feeder. But instead of eating immediately, she turned back to Ezra and made a sound part moo, part rumble that he'd never heard from her before. It was almost like she was saying thank you. Hope, who had been sleeping in the corner of the stall, woke up and immediately began looking for her breakfast. She'd grown stronger over the past 2 weeks, and her personality was beginning to emerge. Unlike her mother's quiet dignity, Hope was curious and playful, investigating everything in her environment with the fearless enthusiasm of youth. Dr. Hutchins arrived for his daily checkup to find both patients doing better than anyone had dared hope. Grace's incision was healing well, her appetite was returning, and her milk production was finally increasing enough to supplement Hope's bottle feedings. "I've got to admit, Ezra," Bill said as he completed his examination, "I didn't think we'd see this day. She's not just surviving, she's actually thriving." The physical recovery was remarkable enough, but it was the emotional transformation that truly amazed everyone who witnessed it. Grace began displaying behaviors that none of them had ever seen in a cow before. She seemed to recognize individual people, responding differently to Ezra than she did to the hired hands. She showed what could only be described as gratitude, often moving to the fence when Ezra approached, as if greeting an old friend. Most remarkably, she began demonstrating an almost maternal protectiveness not just toward Hope, but toward other animals on the ranch. When a barn cat had kittens in the neighboring stall, Grace would watch over them with the same vigilance she showed her own calf. When the ranch dogs came around, she would position herself between them and Hope, not aggressively, but clearly establishing boundaries. "It's like she knows she was saved," Carlos observed one afternoon as they watched Grace carefully supervise Hope's first ventures into the larger paddock. "Like she understands what you did for her and wants to prove she was worth saving." Word of Grace's recovery began to spread throughout the county. Neighbors who'd heard about Ezra's unusual purchase started stopping by to see the cow who'd cheated death. Some came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, but most left with a sense that they'd witnessed something special. Margaret Chun from the auction house drove out one afternoon, bringing with her a photographer from the local newspaper who wanted to do a story about Grace's transformation. The before and after pictures were striking. The broken, bleeding animal from the auction yard was barely recognizable as the healthy, alert cow standing proudly in the Broken Arrow's pasture. "She looks like a completely different animal," Margaret said, shaking her head in amazement. "I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen a recovery like this." The newspaper article, titled "From Death Row to Ranch Royalty," brought even more attention. Letters began arriving from people all over Wyoming and neighboring states, sharing their own stories of rescued animals or simply expressing admiration for Ezra's decision to save Grace. One letter particularly touched Ezra. It came from a young girl named Emma Patterson, whose family owned a small farm in Colorado. She'd read the article with her grandmother and wanted to know if Grace was happy now. The letter was written in careful cursive, decorated with drawings of cows and hearts. "Dear Mr. Blackwood," the letter read, "My grandma says you saved Grace when nobody else would. My mom says that makes you a hero. Is Grace really happy now? Does she know you saved her? I hope she does. Love, Emma. P.S. My grandma says some people are like Grace, broken, but worth saving." Ezra found himself reading that letter multiple times, particularly the postscript. It reminded him of something Sarah used to say during her illness, that sometimes being broken was just the first step toward becoming something stronger and more beautiful than you'd ever been before. As autumn settled over the Broken Arrow, Grace continued to flourish. Her coat had regained its natural luster, her weight had stabilized at a healthy level, and her milk production was excellent. Hope had grown into a precocious young calf who followed her mother everywhere, learning the rhythms of ranch life with eager attention. But it was during the first snowfall of the season that Grace displayed the behavior that would cement her legendary status in the county's folklore. A sudden blizzard had blown in from the north, catching several of the ranch's cattle in an exposed pasture. The storm was severe enough that visibility dropped to near zero, and the temperature plummeted to dangerous levels. Ezra and his crew were preparing to venture out with the trucks to round up the stranded cattle when they noticed Grace acting strangely. She was pacing along the fence line of her paddock, clearly agitated, mooing repeatedly in a pattern that seemed almost like communication. "She's trying to tell us something," Luke observed. Grace suddenly moved to the gate of her paddock and stood there, looking directly at Ezra. When he approached, she stepped back and then forward again, repeating the motion several times. It took Ezra a moment to realize what she was doing. She was asking to be let out. "You want to help, don't you?" Ezra said, studying Grace's behavior. "You think you can find them in this storm?" Against the protests of his men, Ezra opened the gate. Grace immediately headed toward the pasture where the other cattle were stranded, moving with purpose despite the driving snow. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, following some internal compass that the humans couldn't access. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Grace led them directly to the stranded cattle, who had huddled together in a depression. That provided some shelter from the wind. But more than that, she began organizing them, using her body to guide the confused and frightened animals toward the safety of the barn. "I've never seen anything like it," Carlos shouted over the wind as they watched Grace methodically gather the scattered herd. "It's like she's got some kind of supernatural sense about these things." The rescue was completed without the loss of a single animal, thanks largely to Grace's uncanny ability to navigate in conditions that had completely disoriented the humans. As they all stood in the warm barn afterward, watching Grace settle down next to Hope as if nothing extraordinary had happened, Ezra realized that something fundamental had shifted. Grace wasn't just a rescued cow anymore. She'd become the heart and soul of the Broken Arrow Ranch, a living symbol of resilience and renewal that had transformed not just herself, but everyone around her. The broken, bleeding mother who'd been sold for whiskey money had evolved into something approaching the sacred, a creature whose very presence seemed to bring out the best in everything and everyone she encountered. That night, as Ezra sat in his kitchen going through the day's mail, he found another letter from young Emma Patterson in Colorado. This one was shorter, but no less meaningful. "Dear Mr. Blackwood," it read, "I saw the picture of Grace in the snow rescue on the internet. My grandma says Grace isn't just a cow anymore. She says Grace is proof that love can fix anything if you don't give up. Is that true? I hope it is. Your friend, Emma." Ezra looked out his kitchen window toward the barn, where Grace was settled for the night, Hope sleeping peacefully beside her. The question echoed in his mind. Was it true that love could fix anything if you didn't give up? 6 months ago, he would have said no. 6 months ago, he was a broken man convinced that some things like hearts shattered by loss couldn't be repaired. But watching Grace's transformation, being part of her journey from despair to dignity, had taught him that maybe Emma's grandmother was right. Maybe love, patience, and refusing to give up really could fix anything. Even a widowed rancher who'd forgotten how to hope, and a dying cow that everyone else had written off as worthless. As he turned off the kitchen lights and headed to bed, Ezra found himself looking forward to tomorrow in a way he hadn't since Sarah's death. Grace had given him back his purpose, and in return, he'd given her back her life. It seemed like a fair trade. Spring arrived at the Broken Arrow with an explosion of wildflowers that painted the Wyoming hills in brilliant yellows and purples. It had been 8 months since Grace's arrival, and the transformation wasn't limited to just her physical recovery. The entire ranch seemed to pulse with a renewed energy that infected everyone who stepped foot on the property. Grace had become something of a local celebrity, drawing visitors from as far away as Denver and Salt Lake City. Agricultural colleges sent students to study her recovery. Veterinarians came to document her case, and families made weekend trips just to see the famous cow who'd cheated death. Ezra had initially been uncomfortable with the attention, but he'd gradually come to understand that Grace's story meant something to people beyond simple curiosity about livestock. The latest visitor was Dr. Rebecca Martinez from Colorado State University's veterinary program. She'd been studying Grace's case for her research on trauma recovery in large animals, and what she'd discovered was revolutionizing some long-held beliefs about bovine intelligence and emotional capacity. What you've documented here challenges everything we thought we knew about cattle psychology, Dr. Martinez explained as she reviewed her notes with Ezra. Grace displays problem-solving abilities, emotional bonding, and what can only be described as empathy at levels we've never recorded in her species. They were standing in Grace's expanded pasture, watching as she supervised Hope's interactions with a group of younger calves that had been born on the ranch over the winter. Grace had appointed herself as a sort of nursery supervisor, intervening when play got too rough and guiding the youngsters away from potential dangers. She's teaching them, Dr. Martinez continued, pointing to Grace's careful positioning between the calves and a patch of ground that concealed a hidden depression. Look how she uses her body to redirect them. That's not instinct, that's learned behavior being passed on. Hope, now a healthy 8-month-old heifer, had inherited more than just her mother's distinctive markings. She displayed the same unusual intelligence and social awareness that made Grace so remarkable. But where Grace's wisdom seemed born from suffering, Hope's came from confidence and security. She moved through the world with the fearless curiosity of someone who'd never known anything but love and protection. The success of Grace's recovery had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. A documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles had reached out about telling Grace's story, and a children's book author wanted to write about her transformation. Most surprisingly, the Wyoming State Fair had invited Grace to be the centerpiece of their livestock exhibition, offering Ezra a substantial fee just for her appearance. "I don't know about all this hoopla," Ezra confided to Carlos as they repaired fence posts in the south pasture. "Grace isn't a circus act, she's just a cow who got a second chance." Carlos paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. "With respect, boss, she stopped being just a cow the day she led us to those stranded cattle in the blizzard. That was something else entirely." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A sleek black Mercedes pulled into the ranch yard, looking as out of place as a penguin in the desert. The man who emerged wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Blackwood, my name is Vincent Carruthers. I represent some investors who are very interested in discussing a business proposition with you." Ezra and Carlos exchanged glances. In their world, business propositions that arrived in Mercedes sedans usually meant trouble of one kind or another. "What kind of proposition?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew. Carruthers smiled with practiced charm. "We'd like to purchase Grace. We're prepared to offer you $50,000, cash, no questions asked." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of cattle in the pasture and the whisper of wind through the grass. $50,000 was more money than most ranchers saw in a year, enough to pay off debts, upgrade equipment, or secure the ranch's future for years to come. "What would you want with her?" Ezra asked carefully. "Entertainment purposes. We have contracts with several venues that specialize in unusual animal attractions. Grace's story would draw crowds from all over the country. Think of it as giving her a chance to inspire people on a much larger scale." Carlos actually laughed out loud at that, a harsh sound that carried no humor. "You want to put her in a traveling show like some kind of freak?" Carruthers' smile never wavered. "I prefer to think of it as sharing her remarkable story with the world. She'd be very well cared for, I assure you. Only the finest facilities, the best veterinary care, comfortable accommodations." "The answer is no," Ezra said firmly. "Perhaps you should think about it before." "The answer is no," Ezra repeated, his voice carrying a finality that even Carruthers couldn't miss. "Grace isn't for sale. Not for $50,000, Not for 500,000. She's home. Carruthers studied Ezra for a moment, his smile finally fading. That's disappointing. My clients don't usually take no for an answer. They tend to find ways to get what they want. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Carlos stepped closer to Ezra, his hand moving instinctively toward the tool belt where he kept a variety of implements that could serve as weapons if necessary. Is that supposed to scare me? Ezra asked quietly. It's supposed to make you reconsider. 50,000 is a generous offer, but it's not unlimited. Other arrangements could be made if you prefer to be difficult. Get off my land, Ezra said, his voice deadly calm. Now. Carruthers shrugged as if the entire conversation had been merely academic. Of course. But Mr. Blackwood? This conversation isn't over. My clients always get what they want, one way or another. After the Mercedes disappeared down the ranch road, Ezra and Carlos stood in the yard processing what had just happened. The threat had been subtle but unmistakable. If Grace couldn't be bought, other methods might be employed to acquire her. We need to be careful, Carlos said. Men like that don't make empty threats. That evening, Ezra called a meeting with all his hands to discuss increased security measures. Luke would take the night shift watching the barns. Old Pete would monitor the access roads, and Carlos would coordinate patrols during the day. They also installed motion-activated lights around Grace's pasture and set up a camera system that would alert Ezra's phone if anything unusual happened. The precautions proved prescient. 3 nights later, Luke spotted 2 men with bolt cutters attempting to break into Grace's paddock. The intruders fled when he sounded the alarm, but they left behind clear evidence of their intentions. Ezra immediately called the sheriff, but he wasn't optimistic about official help. Men like Carruthers were careful to keep their hands clean, using intermediaries who could disappear without a trace. The attempted theft galvanized the local community in a way that surprised everyone. Word spread quickly through the county, and by the next morning, a steady stream of neighbors began arriving at the Broken Arrow. They came armed with everything from hunting rifles to baseball bats, united in their determination to protect Grace from whoever was trying to take her. This is about more than just one cow, explained Janet Morrison, whose family had run cattle in the area for 4 generations. Grace represents something that can't be bought or sold. She's proof that there's still good in the world, that broken things can be made whole. We're not letting some city slickers steal that from us. The impromptu militia that formed around Grace included ranchers, farmers, shop owners, and retirees. They organized shifts to maintain a constant presence around the clock, turning the Broken Arrow into something resembling a fortress. But it was a fortress built on love rather than fear, protected by people who understood that some things were worth fighting for. Grace seemed to sense the tension surrounding her. She stayed closer to the barn than usual, keeping hope near her side at all times. But rather than appearing frightened, she displayed a calm alertness that suggested she trusted the humans around her to handle whatever threats might emerge. The showdown came on a Thursday morning in late May. Carruthers returned, this time accompanied by a sheriff's deputy and a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as a representative of the county animal control department. Mr. Blackwood, the deputy said, clearly uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. I have a court order requiring you to surrender the animal known as Grace for immediate examination by county veterinary officials. Ezra studied the paperwork, noting the technical language about potential health hazards and public safety concerns. It was obviously a manufactured crisis, designed to provide legal cover for Grace's seizure. This is bullshit, Deputy Franklin, and you know it, Ezra said calmly. Grace has been examined by licensed veterinarians multiple times. She's healthier than most of the cattle in this county. Deputy Franklin nodded unhappily. I know that, Ezra, but the order is legal, and I have to enforce it. I'm sorry. What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook County for decades to come. As the deputy and animal control officer approached Grace's pasture, they found their way blocked by a human wall. 57 people, ranging in age from 18 to 84, stood shoulder to shoulder between the officials and Grace. "You want her, you'll have to go through us," declared old Pete. Speaking for the group with the authority of his 80 years, Deputy Franklin looked at the crowd, then at Carruthers, then back at the crowd. He was facing the prospect of arresting half the county's registered voters over a cow, and his political instincts were warring with his legal obligations. "This is obstruction of justice," the animal control officer protested. "I demand you arrest these people immediately." "Shut up," Deputy Franklin said wearily. "You're not making this any easier." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for Grace herself. Somehow sensing the commotion was about her, she walked to the fence and stood there, looking at the assembled crowd with what appeared to be understanding. Then she did something that no one expected. She approached the fence and extended her head over the top rail, allowing herself to be petted by the people who had come to protect her. The gesture was so trusting, so filled with dignity and grace. Her name had never seemed more appropriate, that even the animal control officer seemed affected by it. This wasn't a dangerous animal that posed a threat to public safety. This was a creature that had inspired an entire community to stand up for what was right. "I can't do this," Deputy Franklin said finally. "Ezra, I'll need you to bring Grace in for examination by a county veterinarian, but she can stay on your property during the process. Mr. Carruthers, I suggest you and your people find somewhere else to be before my patience runs out entirely." Carruthers was furious, but he was also smart enough to recognize a losing battle when he saw one. "This isn't over," he promised as he stalked back to his car. "My clients have significant resources and long memories." "So do we," old Pete called after him. "And we know where you can stick your resources." The veterinary examination, conducted 3 days later by Dr. Patricia Wells from the State Agriculture Department, was as thorough as it was pointless. Dr. Wells spent 4 hours examining Grace from every conceivable angle, testing her blood, checking her reflexes, and documenting her overall condition. "This is one of the healthiest cattle I've ever examined," Dr. Wells told the assembled crowd. Afterward, "Whatever you've been doing here, Mr. Blackwood, you should teach classes on it." The official clean bill of health effectively ended Carruthers' legal maneuvering, but it didn't end the threats. Ezra began receiving anonymous phone calls at all hours, warning him that Grace would disappear if he didn't reconsider the offer. His mail included photographs of the ranch taken from various angles, a clear message that his property was being watched. The psychological pressure was designed to wear him down, to make him doubt his ability to protect Grace indefinitely. But Carruthers had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd assumed that Ezra was fighting this battle alone. The community that had rallied around Grace didn't disperse after the confrontation with the deputies. Instead, it organized itself into something more permanent. Calling themselves the Grace Guard, they established a rotating schedule of volunteers who maintained a presence at the ranch 24 hours a day. They installed their own security system, complete with cameras and motion detectors that rivaled anything the county sheriff's department had access to. More importantly, they began documenting everything. Every phone call, every threatening letter, every suspicious vehicle that appeared on the county roads was photographed, recorded, and reported to authorities. They turned Carruthers' surveillance tactics against him, making it impossible for his people to operate without being observed and documented. The tide began to turn when Margaret Chun from the auction house received a visit from a federal investigator, looking into allegations of livestock trafficking and extortion. It turned out that Carruthers' organization had been operating similar schemes in several western states, using legal intimidation and physical threats to acquire unusual animals for private collectors and entertainment venues. Grace isn't the First animal they've targeted, Agent Sarah Cooper explained during a meeting at the ranch. But thanks to your documentation and the community's response, she might be the last. We have enough evidence to bring federal charges against the entire operation. The arrests came on a crisp morning in early June. Carruthers and 6 associates were taken into custody in coordinated raids across 3 states, charged with conspiracy, extortion, and violations of multiple animal welfare statutes. The investigation revealed a network of corrupt officials, forged documents, and intimidation tactics that had operated for years without detection. "It's over," Agent Cooper told Ezra as they watched the last of the federal vehicles leave the ranch. "Carruthers won't be bothering you or anyone else for a very long time." That evening, the Grace Guard organized a celebration that drew people from across the county. Tables were set up in the ranch yard, loaded with potluck dishes and homemade desserts. Children ran between the adults while their parents shared stories and laughter under the star-filled Wyoming sky. Grace and Hope watched the festivities from their pasture, occasionally approaching the fence to investigate the unusual activity. Someone had strung lights around their paddock, casting a warm glow that made the 2 cows look almost ethereal in the darkness. "You know what the funny thing is?" Ezra said to Carlos as they watched Grace interacting with a group of children who'd convinced their parents to let them feed her carrots through the fence. "I thought I was saving her. Turns out she was saving all of us." Carlos nodded, understanding exactly what his boss meant. Grace had become more than just a rescued cow. She'd become a catalyst for community, a reason for people to remember what was worth fighting for in an increasingly complicated world. As the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, Ezra found himself alone with Grace and Hope in the quiet of the pasture. The lights had been turned off, leaving only starlight to illuminate the scene. Grace approached the fence and rested her massive head against the top rail, allowing Ezra to scratch behind her ears in the way she'd come to enjoy. "We did it, girl," he said softly. "You're safe, you're home, and nobody's ever going to take that away from you again." Grace made the soft rumbling sound that had become her way of responding to Ezra's voice. In the darkness, it sounded almost like contentment, the sound of a creature who had finally found her place in the world and knew that she was loved. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, nearly a year after Grace first set foot on the Broken Arrow. It bore the official seal of the American Livestock Heritage Foundation, an organization Ezra had heard of but never paid much attention to. Inside was an invitation that would change everything. "Mr. Blackwood," the letter began, "it is our honor to inform you that Grace has been selected as a nominee for the Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award for Exceptional Contribution to Agricultural Heritage. This award recognizes animals whose stories have transcended their immediate circumstances to inspire broader understanding of the human-animal bond." The ceremony would take place in Denver in November, with Grace being formally inducted into the National Registry of Significant Agricultural Animals. It was an honor previously reserved for legendary horses, prize-winning bulls, and animals whose bloodlines had shaped entire breeds. Grace would be the first rescue animal ever considered for such recognition. "They want to give Grace an award?" Luke asked incredulously as Ezra shared the news with his crew. "Like an actual award with a ceremony and everything?" "Says here there'll be agricultural officials from across the country," Ezra read from the letter. "Representatives from major universities, breed associations, and livestock organizations. They want to present Grace as an example of how proper care and dedication can transform even the most hopeless situations." Old Pete removed his weathered cap and scratched his head. "Well, I'll be damned. Our Grace rubbing shoulders with the fancy folks." The news of Grace's nomination spread through the county faster than wildfire in August. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline "Local Cow Nominated for National Honor," complete with a photograph of Grace standing regally. In her pasture, Hope grazing peacefully beside her. Television stations from Denver and Cheyenne sent crews to interview Ezra and document Grace's daily life. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Emma Patterson, the young girl from Colorado who had been writing to Ezra since Grace's rescue, convinced her parents to drive the 300 miles to visit the ranch. When their dusty pickup truck pulled into the yard, a gangly 10-year-old, with bright eyes and braided hair, practically bounced out of the passenger seat. "Is that really her?" Emma asked breathlessly, pointing toward Grace's pasture. "Is that really Grace?" Ezra smiled, remembering his own children's excitement at that age. "That's her. Would you like to meet her?" What followed was one of those moments that reminded Ezra why Grace's story mattered so much. Emma approached the fence with the careful reverence of someone entering a cathedral. Grace, as if sensing the significance of the moment, walked directly to where the girl stood and lowered her massive head to Emma's level. "Hi, Grace," Emma whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "I've been writing letters about you, Mr. Blackwood. Probably told you, right?" Grace responded with her characteristic soft rumble, allowing Emma to stroke her forehead with small, gentle hands. The cow stood perfectly still, as if she understood that this was a sacred moment for the child. "My grandma was right," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "You really are proof that love can fix anything." Emma's grandmother, it turned out, had recently passed away after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease. The family had been struggling with grief and the difficult transition of losing their matriarch. Grace's story had become a source of comfort for Emma, a tangible example that broken things could become beautiful again. "She made us promise to come see Grace if we ever got the chance," Emma's father explained to Ezra. "Mom always said that. Some stories are too important to just read about. You have to witness them for yourself." The visit lasted 3 hours, during which Emma documented every detail of Grace's daily routine with the intensity of a research scientist. She took photographs, asked detailed questions about Grace's care, and even helped with the afternoon feeding. By the time they left, she had declared her intention to become a veterinarian specializing in rescue animals. "Grace gave that little girl hope again," Emma's mother said as they prepared to leave. After losing her grandmother, Emma had started to believe that everything good eventually goes away. Seeing Grace proved to her that sometimes the best things come after the worst things happen. The weeks leading up to the Denver ceremony were a wind of preparation. Grace would need to travel to Colorado for the event, which meant coordinating with veterinarians, transportation specialists, and security personnel. The foundation was taking no chances with their guest of honor. Grace would travel in a custom-built trailer with climate control, cushioned flooring, and round-the-clock monitoring. More challenging than the logistics was the question of what Grace's presence at such an event would mean. This wasn't just an agricultural award ceremony, it was Grace's formal elevation from rescued cow to living symbol. The weight of that transformation wasn't lost on anyone involved. "Are you sure about this?" Dr. Hutchins asked during one of his regular checkups. Grace has never been away from the ranch since she arrived. The stress of travel, strange surroundings, crowds of people, it could be overwhelming for her. Ezra had been wrestling with the same concerns. Grace had found peace and security at the Broken Arrow. Taking her away from everything familiar seemed like a betrayal of the sanctuary he'd created for her. But there was another consideration that ultimately tipped the balance. How many people do you think will hear Grace's story because of this ceremony? Ezra asked. How many Emma Pattersons out there need to know that broken things can be made whole again? The question answered itself. Grace's story had already inspired thousands of people through newspaper articles and word of mouth. The ceremony would amplify that message on a national scale, reaching people who desperately needed to hear that recovery was possible, that love and patience could triumph over despair, The journey to Denver took place on a crisp November morning that painted the Colorado landscape in brilliant golds and oranges. Grace traveled like royalty, accompanied by Ezra, Dr. Hutchins, and a small convoy of supporters who had insisted on making the trip. Hope remained at the ranch with Carlos, who promised to spoil her outrageously in Grace's absence. Grace handled the travel better than anyone had dared hope. She seemed curious about the changing scenery visible through the trailer's windows, occasionally moving to different positions to get better views of the mountains and valleys passing by. It was as if she understood that this journey was different from any other trip she'd ever taken. The Denver Livestock Exhibition Center had been transformed for the ceremony. Banners celebrating agricultural heritage hung from the rafters, and displays showcasing the achievements of previous award recipients lined the walls. But the centerpiece was a specially constructed presentation area where Grace would be formally recognized. The crowd that assembled for the ceremony was unlike anything Ezra had ever seen. Agricultural officials in their finest suits mingled, with working ranchers still carrying the dust of their morning chores. University professors shared conversations with cattle breeders whose families had been raising livestock for generations. At the center of it all was a shared recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Grace's entrance into the exhibition hall created a hush that was almost reverent. She walked beside Ezra with the dignity of a queen approaching. Her throne, her head held high and her movements graceful despite her massive size. The crowd parted naturally, creating a pathway that led directly to the presentation platform. Dr. Patricia Sumners, the foundation's president, stepped to the microphone to begin the ceremony. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades working with agricultural animals, but there was also genuine emotion in her words. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today not just to honor an exceptional animal, but to celebrate the power of compassion to transform lives. Grace's story reminds us that agricultural stewardship extends far beyond profit margins and production statistics. It encompasses our responsibility to recognize the inherent dignity of every creature under our care. The formal presentation included a detailed recounting of Grace's journey from the auction yard to her current status as an inspiration to people across the country. Photographs displayed on large screens showed her transformation from broken victim to confident matriarch, each image documenting another step in her remarkable recovery. But it was the testimonial videos that truly captured the impact of Grace's story. Emma Patterson appeared on screen, now articulate and passionate in her advocacy for animal rescue. Dr. Martinez shared research findings that had revolutionized understanding of bovine intelligence and emotional capacity. Even Deputy Franklin, the lawman who had been forced to confront Grace's would-be captors, spoke about how her story had reminded him why he'd chosen to serve his community. Grace represents something that transcends species boundaries, Dr. Martinez explained in her video. She demonstrates that intelligence, empathy, and resilience are not uniquely human traits. Her recovery has challenged our fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and the depth of emotional bonds possible between humans and livestock. The climax of the ceremony came when Dr. Sumners presented Grace with her official award, beautifully crafted bronze medallion that would be permanently displayed at the ranch. But more than the physical recognition, it was the moment when Grace was formally inducted into the National Registry that marked her transformation from rescued animal to living legend. Grace of the Broken Arrow Ranch, Dr. Sumners announced. We recognize you as an exceptional contributor to American agricultural heritage, a testament to the power of compassion, and an inspiration to all who believe in the possibility of redemption and renewal. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes. Grown men who had spent their lives working with cattle wiped tears from their eyes. Women who had built careers in agricultural science applauded with the enthusiasm usually reserved for rock concerts. And through it all, Grace stood calmly beside Ezra, occasionally turning her head to acknowledge the crowd with what could only be described as gracious acceptance. The reception that followed the ceremony was an extended celebration of Grace's impact on everyone she'd touched. People shared stories of how her rescue had inspired them to take chances on animals others had written off. Veterinary students spoke about choosing specializations in trauma recovery because of her example. Ranchers described changes in how they approached animal welfare based on witnessing her transformation. But perhaps the most profound moment came when a young man approached Ezra during the reception. He introduced himself as Marcus Wells, a recent graduate of veterinary school who had been struggling with depression and thoughts of giving up his chosen career. "I read about Grace during my darkest period," Marcus explained. "I was convinced that I wasn't cut out for this work, that I couldn't handle seeing so much suffering and loss. But Grace's story showed me that sometimes the animals we save end up saving us right back. She gave me the courage to keep going." Marcus had just accepted a position with a large animal rescue organization in Texas, inspired directly by Grace's example. His story was repeated throughout the evening. People whose lives had been changed by witnessing the power of second chances, unconditional care. As the ceremony wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Ezra found himself alone with Grace in the quiet exhibition hall. The bronze medallion gleamed in the overhead lights, a tangible symbol of how far they'd both traveled since that desperate day at the auction. "What do you think, girl?" Ezra asked, scratching behind Grace's ears in the familiar gesture that had become their private ritual. "Pretty fancy stuff for a cow who was supposed to be dog food." Grace responded with her characteristic rumble, but there was something different about it now. It carried a note of satisfaction, as if she understood the significance of what had just occurred. She had been formally recognized not just as a survivor, but as a teacher whose lessons extended far beyond the boundaries of agricultural science. The journey back to Wyoming took place under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than usual. Grace settled into her traveling quarters with obvious relief, clearly eager to return to the familiar surroundings of the Broken Arrow. But something fundamental had changed during their time in Denver. Grace was no longer just a rescued cow who had found sanctuary. She was now officially recognized as an ambassador for the power of compassion and the possibility of transformation. When they arrived back at the ranch in the early hours of the morning, Hope was waiting in the pasture, calling out to her mother with obvious excitement. The reunion between mother and daughter was joyful but dignified, as if Grace was sharing stories of her grand adventure with the young cow who would one day inherit her legacy. Standing in his kitchen as dawn broke over the Wyoming hills, Ezra reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months ago, he had been a broken man convinced that his best days were behind him. Grace had been a dying cow destined for the rendering plant. Together, they had discovered that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest act of refusing to give up on something that everyone else has written off. Grace was no longer just a cow. She was living proof that love, patience, and unwavering commitment could transform even the most hopeless situations into something beautiful and meaningful. She had become his sacred Empress, ruling over a kingdom built on second chances and the unshakable belief that every life has value worth fighting for. Years after Grace's triumphant return from Denver, the Broken Arrow Ranch had become something entirely different from what Ezra had ever imagined. What started as a working cattle operation had evolved into a pilgrimage destination, a place where people came seeking the same transformation that Grace had undergone. The bronze medallion from the Heritage Foundation ceremony now hung in a place of honor in the ranch's visitor center. But it was Grace herself who remained the true attraction. The visitor center hadn't existed before Grace's arrival. Ezra had built it out of necessity as the steady stream of visitors threatened to overwhelm the ranch's daily operations. Inside, photographs documented Grace's journey from the auction yard to her current status as agricultural royalty. Letters from around the world filled display cases, testimonials from people whose lives had been touched by her story. But the most popular feature was the large window that provided a perfect view of Grace's domain, a 20-acre pasture that had been specially designed for her comfort and dignity. Grace ruled her domain with the serene authority of a benevolent monarch. At 4 years old, she had reached full maturity, standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing close to 1,400 pounds. Her coat gleamed with health, her movements carried the confident grace of royalty, and her eyes held a wisdom that seemed almost supernatural. Hope, now 2 years old and pregnant with her first calf, had inherited her mother's distinctive intelligence and calm demeanor. The morning routine at the Broken Arrow had become a carefully choreographed ritual that drew visitors from around the world. Grace would emerge from her custom-built barn at precisely 7:30 each morning, surveying her domain with the regal bearing of an empress reviewing her kingdom. She would check on the other cattle in nearby pastures, ensuring their well-being with the same protective instincts she'd once shown during the blizzard rescue. "She knows exactly what time it is," marveled Dr. Jennifer Carlton, an animal behaviorist from Oxford University who had come to study Grace's unique social dynamics. "Her internal clock is so precise that we could set our watches by her daily routine. But more than that, she's actively managing the social structure of the entire herd. She's appointed herself as a sort of bovine matriarch, mediating disputes and ensuring harmony." Dr. Carleton's research had uncovered behaviors in Grace that challenged fundamental assumptions about cattle intelligence. Grace demonstrated problem-solving abilities typically associated with much more complex animals. She could open gates by manipulating latches with her nose. She recognized individual humans by sight even after months of absence. And she had developed a sophisticated communication system with both other cattle and the ranch's human inhabitants. Most remarkable discovery was Grace's apparent ability to sense emotional distress in visitors. Time and again, people dealing with grief, depression, or trauma found themselves drawn to her pasture, and Grace would invariably approach the fence to offer what could only be described as comfort. She seemed to know instinctively when someone needed her attention, often abandoning her regular activities to stand quietly beside visitors who were struggling with personal pain. "It's like she remembers what it felt like to be broken," observed Dr. Martinez during one of her regular visits to document Grace's ongoing development. "She recognizes that pain in others and responds with a kind of empathy that we're only beginning to understand." The transformation of the Broken Arrow into what locals had begun calling Grace's sanctuary brought unexpected challenges and rewards. Ezra found himself managing not just a ranch, but a small industry built around hope and healing. The visitor center gift shop sold books about Grace's story, photographs of her daily life, and replicas of her Heritage Foundation medallion, with all proceeds going toward animal rescue organizations across the country. More importantly, the ranch had become a training ground for a new generation of animal welfare advocates. Veterinary students came for internships, learning not just clinical skills, but the deeper philosophy of seeing animals as individuals worthy of respect and care. Young ranchers studied Grace's management as an example of how agricultural operations could prioritize animal welfare without sacrificing economic viability. The success story attracted the attention of Hollywood producers, documentary filmmakers, and book publishers. Ezra had turned down most of these offers, protective of Grace's privacy and wary of commercializing her story. But he had agreed to participate in a children's book series about animal rescue, knowing that Grace's story could inspire a new generation of animal advocates. Emma Patterson, now 13 and working toward her goal of becoming a veterinarian, had been chosen to write the foreword for the first book. Her words captured the essence of what Grace represented to so many people. "Grace teaches us that being broken isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning of a different story. She shows us that love isn't just a feeling, it's an action. Every day, Mr. Blackwood chose to love Grace by taking care of her, and Grace chose to love him back by becoming everything she was meant to be. That's the most important lesson anyone can learn. The international recognition of Grace's story had an unexpected consequence. It sparked a global movement toward more humane treatment of agricultural animals. Ranchers began sharing their own rescue stories. Veterinary schools incorporated trauma recovery into their curricula, and animal welfare organizations reported significant increases in funding and volunteer support. Grace has become more than just a success story, explained Dr. Patricia Sumners during a follow-up interview 3 years after the Heritage Foundation ceremony. She's become a symbol of what's possible when we choose compassion over convenience, when we see the individual worth of every creature under our care. Her influence extends far beyond the boundaries of one Wyoming ranch. The ripple effects of Grace's story continued to spread in ways that surprised everyone involved. A children's hospital in Denver had created a Grace ward dedicated to young patients dealing with trauma and recovery. A scholarship program for veterinary students specializing in large animal rescue bore her name. Agricultural colleges across the country included her case, studying courses on animal psychology and welfare. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from an unexpected source. The auction house where Grace had first been sold had undergone its own transformation, implementing new policies to ensure that no animal would ever again be sold in the condition Grace had been in. They had established a rescue fund, supported by voluntary contributions from buyers and sellers specifically, designed to help animals that might otherwise be destined for slaughter due to poor condition or health problems. Grace changed how we think about our responsibility to these animals, Margaret Chun explained during the auction house's 5th annual Grace Day fundraiser. We realized that being in the livestock business means more than just facilitating sales, it means being stewards of animal welfare. On a crisp October morning, exactly 3 years after Grace's arrival at the Broken Arrow, Ezra found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them both so far from where they started. He was standing in Grace's pasture, watching as she supervised Hope's interaction with her week-old calf, a healthy heifer they had named Faith, continuing the tradition of names that reflected the ranch's transformation. Grace had become a grandmother, with the same dignity and wisdom she brought to everything else. She watched over Faith with protective intensity while allowing Hope to handle the primary maternal duties. It was a perfect metaphor for the way Grace had influenced the entire ranch, providing guidance and protection while allowing others to find their own paths to growth and healing. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted Ezra's contemplation. A convoy of cars and trucks was making its way up the ranch road, carrying what had become a monthly pilgrimage of visitors from the Children's Hospital in Denver. These weren't casual tourists seeking entertainment, they were families dealing with serious illness, looking for inspiration and hope in Grace's story of recovery and transformation. Ezra watched as the group assembled at the pasture fence, a mix of children in wheelchairs, parents carrying medical equipment, and hospital staff who had learned that sometimes the best medicine came in the form of a gentle giant who understood suffering and healing in ways that textbooks couldn't capture. Grace noticed the arrival of the special visitors and immediately abandoned her supervision of Faith to approach the fence. She had learned to recognize the different types of people who came to see her, and she reserved her most gentle demeanor for the children who needed her comfort most. A small boy in a wheelchair, probably 7 or 8 years old, reached through the fence with a trembling hand. Grace lowered her massive head until the child could touch her forehead, then stood perfectly still while he stroked her face with fingers made weak by illness, but strong with determination. "She's beautiful," the boy whispered, his words barely audible but filled with wonder. "Is it true that she was really sick once too?" "Very sick," Ezra confirmed, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "Sicker than she should have ever gotten better from." But she's proof that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who've had to fight the hardest to get strong. The boy nodded solemnly, understanding the metaphor in the way that children facing serious illness often do. He continued petting Grace for several more minutes, drawing strength from her calm presence and dignified bearing. When it was time for the group to leave, he reluctantly pulled his hand back but promised Grace that he would keep fighting, just like she had Dot. As the convoy of vehicles disappeared down the ranch road, Ezra remained in the pasture with Grace, both of them processing the emotional weight of these regular encounters with human suffering and hope. Grace had become more than just a rescued cow. She had evolved into a living symbol of resilience, a tangible reminder that recovery was possible even from the most desperate circumstances. "You know what Sarah would say if she could see all this?" Ezra asked Grace, scratching behind her ears in their familiar ritual. "She'd say that you didn't just get rescued, you became the rescuer." Grace responded with her characteristic soft rumble, a sound that had become as familiar and comforting to Ezra as his late wife's voice had once been. But there was something different about it now, a note of contentment and purpose that hadn't been there in the early days of her recovery. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming hills, painting the sky in the brilliant oranges and purples that Sarah had always loved, Ezra found himself thinking about the improbable journey that had brought him and Grace to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been a broken man who bought a dying cow in a desperate attempt to find something worth caring about. Today, he was the guardian of a living legend whose story had inspired thousands of people around the world. Grace had fulfilled every implication of her transformation from a bleeding mother sold for whiskey to a sacred empress. She ruled over her domain with wisdom and compassion. She commanded respect and devotion from everyone who encountered her, and she had become a symbol of hope that transcended the boundaries of species, geography, and circumstance. The bronze medallion in the visitor center bore official recognition of her status, but the true measure of Grace's elevation to sacred status was visible every day in the faces of the people who came to see her. Children facing illness found courage in her presence. Adults dealing with loss discovered that healing was possible. Students learned that intelligence and empathy weren't limited to humans. Ranchers realized that profitability and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. Hope approached with faith in tow. The 3 generations of remarkable cattle representing past struggle, present triumph, and future possibility. Grace nuzzled her daughter and granddaughter with the gentle authority of a matriarch who had established a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. As darkness settled over the Broken Arrow Ranch and the stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Ezra headed back to the house, leaving Grace and her family to their peaceful evening in the pasture. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories of struggle and hope, new opportunities for Grace to demonstrate that transformation was always possible for those willing to believe in it. The widowed rancher who had once lost his way in grief had found his purpose in caring for a cow that everyone else had given up on. The bleeding mother who had been sold for whiskey money had become an empress whose domain stretched far beyond the boundaries of any physical ranch, ruling over hearts and minds that had been touched by her story of redemption and renewal. In the end, they had saved each other, and in doing so, they had created something sacred that would continue to inspire and heal long after their individual stories had passed into legend. Grace had become exactly what her name implied, a living embodiment of divine favor, a sacred empress whose kingdom was built on love, patience, and the unshakable belief that every life has infinite worth. The transformation was complete, but the story would never end. As long as there were broken hearts in need of healing and lost souls searching for hope, Grace's legacy would continue to work its quiet miracles. One visitor at a time, one life at a time, one moment of grace at a time. 5 years had passed since Grace first stepped onto the Broken Arrow Ranch, and the world had taken notice in ways that defied every prediction. What began as one man's impulsive decision to save a dying cow had cascaded into a movement that was reshaping how humanity understood its relationship with animals. Grace's influence had spread like ripples on a pond, touching lives across continents and inspiring changes that would outlast generations. The morning of Grace's 5th anniversary at the ranch dawned with unusual activity. Television crews from 3 major networks had arrived to document what had become known as Grace Day, an international celebration of animal rescue and rehabilitation that now occurred annually on the date of her arrival at the Broken Arrow. But this year was different. This year, Grace was about to achieve something that no agricultural animal in history had ever accomplished. Dr. Helena Morrison, Director of Animal Welfare Studies at Cambridge University, stood in Grace's pasture holding a document that would forever change how the world viewed livestock intelligence and emotional capacity. After 5 years of rigorous study, an international consortium of universities had concluded that Grace demonstrated cognitive abilities and emotional intelligence that warranted legal protection typically reserved for endangered species. What we've documented here transcends everything we thought we knew about bovine consciousness, Dr. Morrison explained to the assembled media. Grace doesn't just respond to stimuli, she demonstrates metacognition, the ability to think about thinking. She plans, she empathizes, she teaches, and she grieves. In every measurable way, she exhibits what we must recognize as personhood. The legal implications were staggering. Grace was about to become the first farm animal in history to be granted individual legal status, with protections that would ensure her well-being for the remainder of her natural life. More importantly, her case was being used as precedent for new legislation that would revolutionize animal welfare standards across the agricultural industry. Ezra watched the proceedings with mixed emotions. Pride in Grace's achievements warred with concern about what this level of attention might mean for their quiet life at the ranch. At 57, he had become something of a celebrity himself, sought after as a speaker at agricultural conferences and animal welfare symposiums around the world. But celebrity had never been his goal. All he'd ever wanted was to give Grace a chance at dignity and peace. "You nervous about all this, girl?" Ezra asked as Grace stood beside him, observing the media circus with her characteristic calm dignity. She seemed more curious than concerned about the cameras and microphones, occasionally moving closer to investigate the equipment with the fearless confidence that had become her trademark. Grace had aged gracefully into her role as the world's most famous cow. At 7 years old, she was in her prime, standing nearly 7 feet tall and commanding respect through presence rather than size. Her coat had developed an almost luminous quality, as if good health and emotional well-being had transformed her very essence. But it was her eyes that truly set her apart: intelligent, compassionate, and filled with what could only be described as wisdom. The ceremony began with testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by Grace's story. Dr. Sarah Chun, now director of the world's largest animal trauma recovery program, spoke via video link from her headquarters in Geneva. Her research foundation, inspired directly by Grace's transformation, had successfully rehabilitated over 10,000 animals across 43 countries. Grace didn't just recover from trauma, Dr. Chun explained. She became living proof that recovery is possible. Her case studies have revolutionized our understanding of animal psychology and opened doors to healing methods we never thought possible. Emma Patterson, now 18 and a freshman at veterinary school, delivered the keynote address in person. The shy 10-year-old who had once driven 300 miles to meet Grace had grown into a passionate advocate for animal rights, with Grace's story serving as the foundation of her life's work. "Grace taught me that healing isn't just about medicine, it's about love, patience, and refusing to give up on someone when everyone else already has," Emma told the crowd. "Every day I study to become a veterinarian, I carry Grace's lesson with me, that the most broken things often become the most beautiful, if someone is willing to believe in them. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Marcus Blackwood, Ezra's son, had flown in from California specifically for the ceremony. The successful tech entrepreneur, who had once viewed his father's ranch as a relic of the past, now stood before the crowd with tears in his eyes. 5 years ago, I thought my father had lost his mind when he bought Grace, Marcus admitted. I saw it as the desperate act of a man who couldn't cope with grief. I was wrong about everything. Grace didn't just save my father, she taught our entire family what it means to choose love over logic, hope over practicality. She showed us that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that don't make sense to anyone else. The formal presentation of Grace's legal recognition took place in a specially constructed pavilion that overlooked her domain. Representatives from the United Nations, the World Wildlife Federation, and major agricultural organizations had traveled to Wyoming to witness this historic moment. Grace stood at the center of it all, wearing a ceremonial blanket embroidered with symbols representing animal welfare organizations from around the world. Today, we acknowledge that consciousness, intelligence, and emotional capacity are not exclusively human traits, announced Dr. Klaus Weber, representing the International Committee for Animal Rights. Grace has demonstrated that individual animals can transcend their traditional roles to become teachers, healers, and ambassadors for their species. In recognizing her unique status, we acknowledge our responsibility to protect not just her well-being, but the well-being of all creatures capable of similar consciousness. The legal document granted Grace unprecedented protections. She could never be sold, relocated without her consent, as determined by behavioral assessment, or used for any purpose that might cause her distress. More importantly, her genetic material was protected, ensuring that any offspring would inherit similar safeguards. Grace had essentially become a sovereign entity, ruling over her domain with legally recognized authority. The international attention brought unexpected opportunities and challenges. The Grace Foundation, established to manage her legacy and fund animal welfare research, received donations from around the world. Major corporations sought partnerships, offering everything from premium feed to luxury accommodations in exchange. For association with Grace's story. More meaningfully, Grace's case had inspired legislative changes across the globe. The European Union had passed the Grace Protocol, establishing minimum standards for animal consciousness assessment in agricultural settings. Japan had implemented new protections for animals, demonstrating exceptional intelligence. Even developing nations were incorporating Grace-inspired welfare standards into their agricultural policies, but success brought its own burdens. The constant stream of visitors, while manageable, had begun to affect Grace's daily routines. The ranch that had once been her sanctuary was increasingly becoming a public space, with all the complications that entailed. Ezra found himself struggling to balance Grace's status as a global icon with her needs as an individual animal seeking peace and normalcy. The solution came from an unexpected partnership with the Wyoming state government. Recognizing Grace's economic and cultural impact on the region, the state offered to designate the Broken Arrow as an official wildlife preserve, providing funding and legal protections while allowing Grace to remain in her familiar environment. Grace has become more than just a resident of Wyoming. She's become an ambassador for our state's values of independence, resilience, and caring for what matters most, explained Governor Patricia Hendricks during the signing ceremony. This designation ensures that Grace will always have a home here, protected by the full authority of state law. The preserved status brought new opportunities for education and research. The Broken Arrow became home to the world's first institute for large animal consciousness studies, attracting researchers from every continent. Students came to study not just Grace, but the broader implications of her cognitive abilities for understanding animal intelligence. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a cognitive scientist from Tokyo University, spent 6 months at the ranch documenting Grace's problem-solving abilities. Her research revealed that Grace could distinguish between different types of human emotional distress and adjust her responses accordingly, offering physical comfort to those dealing with grief, maintaining distance from those experiencing anger, and providing gentle presence to children facing fear. Grace has developed what we can only describe as emotional intelligence, Dr. Tanaka explained in her groundbreaking paper. She reads human emotional states with accuracy that rivals trained therapy animals, but she does so with the added dimension of conscious choice. She decides how to respond based on assessment of individual needs. The research attracted attention from psychologists and psychiatrists working with human trauma victims. Grace's apparent ability to provide therapeutic benefit without formal training suggested new possibilities for animal-assisted healing. Several medical facilities began exploring partnerships with the ranch, seeking to understand how Grace's natural empathy might be replicated in other therapeutic settings. Hope had inherited more than just her mother's physical traits. Now 3 years old and mother to 2 calves of her own, Hope displayed similar cognitive abilities and emotional intelligence. But where Grace's wisdom seemed earned through suffering, Hope's came from confidence and security. She had never known anything but love and respect, and it showed in her fearless curiosity and natural leadership abilities. Faith, Grace's granddaughter, represented the 3rd generation of extraordinary cattle at the Broken Arrow. At 2 years old, she already showed signs of the exceptional intelligence that had made Grace famous. But Faith's abilities went beyond even her grandmother's. She had begun demonstrating what appeared to be artistic expression, arranging objects in her environment in patterns that served no practical purpose, but displayed obvious aesthetic consideration. "We're witnessing evolution in real time," observed Dr. Martinez during one of her regular visits. Grace's offspring aren't just inheriting her physical traits, they're inheriting her enhanced cognitive abilities. We may be looking at the emergence of a new level of bovine consciousness. The implications extended far beyond the ranch. Cattle breeders around the world were requesting genetic material from Grace's lineage, hoping to incorporate her exceptional traits into their own herds. Agricultural universities were establishing research programs to study the hereditary nature of advanced animal intelligence. The possibility that consciousness and empathy could be deliberately cultivated in livestock populations opened entirely new fields of study. But perhaps the most significant development was the transformation of Jimmy Crawdad, Grace's original owner. The man who had sold her for whiskey money had been following her story from a distance, watching as the animal he discarded became internationally famous. The contrast between his neglect and her success had forced him to confront his own failings in ways that eventually led to sobriety and a complete change in lifestyle. Jimmy had spent the past 2 years working as a volunteer at animal rescue facilities, dedicating his life to making amends for his past treatment of Grace and countless other animals. His transformation had become part of Grace's extended story, proof that redemption was possible for everyone involved in her journey. "I can't undo what I did to Grace," Jimmy explained during a rare interview. "But I can spend the rest of my life making sure no other animal suffers the way she did because of my selfishness and addiction. Grace forgave me by becoming everything I prevented her from being. The least I can do is honor that by protecting other animals who need someone to fight for them." As winter settled over the Broken Arrow Preserve, Grace's daily routines had adapted to accommodate her status as both a global icon and a grandmother concerned with family duties. She spent mornings supervising the education of her offspring, afternoons receiving visitors and researchers, and evenings simply being a cow grazing peacefully in pastures that had become her kingdom. The bronze medallion from the Heritage Foundation ceremony had been joined by dozens of other honors from around the world. Awards from animal welfare organizations, recognition from agricultural societies, and honorary degrees from universities created a display that chronicled Grace's journey from victim to victor. But the most meaningful recognition remained the simple truth of her daily existence. She was loved, respected, and protected by a global community that had learned from her example. Standing in his kitchen on a quiet December evening, Ezra reflected on the improbable chain of events that had transformed his ranch into an international destination and his rescue cow into a legally protected entity with her own research institute. The changes sometimes felt overwhelming, but they had all served a single purpose: ensuring that Grace's story would continue to inspire and heal long after her natural life had ended. Grace had achieved something unprecedented in the history of human-animal relationships. She had transcended her species to become a teacher, a healer, and a symbol of hope for millions of people around the world. She had proven that intelligence, empathy, and consciousness were not exclusively human traits, opening new possibilities for how humanity might interact with the animal kingdom. Most importantly, she had shown that love, patience, and refusing to give up on someone could transform the most hopeless situations into miracles. The bleeding mother sold for whiskey had become a sacred empress whose reign would be remembered for generations, ruling over a kingdom built on compassion and sustained by the unshakable belief that every life has infinite worth. The telegram arrived on a snowy February morning in Grace's 6th year at the Broken Arrow, bearing news that would test everything the ranch had come to represent. Queen Elizabeth II, in one of her final official acts before her passing, had requested Grace's presence at Windsor Castle for an unprecedented ceremony. Her Majesty wished to present Grace with the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals' highest honor, a recognition never before bestowed upon an individual farm animal. "They want to fly Grace to England?" Luke asked incredulously as Ezra shared the invitation with his expanded crew. The ranch now employed 12 full-time staff members, including veterinarians, researchers, and security personnel needed to manage Grace's international status. Dr. Patricia Wells, who had become Grace's primary veterinarian and closest human companion besides Ezra, studied the official documents with professional concern. The stress of international travel, quarantine procedures, unfamiliar surroundings, it could be overwhelming for any animal, even one as adaptable as Grace. But Grace herself seemed to sense the significance of the moment. When Ezra approached her pasture with the telegram still in his hand, she walked directly to the fence and fixed him with those intelligent eyes that had guided so many of his decisions over the years. There was no fear in her gaze, only curiosity and what appeared to be anticipation. The logistics of transporting Grace across the Atlantic Ocean required unprecedented coordination between multiple governments, airlines, and veterinary authorities. A specially modified cargo aircraft was commissioned, equipped with climate control, medical monitoring equipment, and accommodations that would ensure Grace's comfort throughout the journey. The British government waived standard quarantine requirements, recognizing Grace's unique status and comprehensive health documentation. More challenging than the physical arrangements were the philosophical questions raised by the invitation. Grace's presence at Windsor Castle would mark the first time in history that a farm animal had been received as an honored guest by the British Crown. The symbolism was staggering. A cow who had once been destined for slaughter would be walking the same halls that had hosted kings, queens, and world leaders for centuries. The departure from Wyoming drew crowds that rivaled Grace's original Heritage Foundation ceremony. Representatives from every major news organization in the world gathered to document Grace's journey to England. The governor of Wyoming presented her with an official state proclamation declaring her Wyoming's ambassador of compassion. Even the President of the United States sent a personal message acknowledging Grace's contribution to advancing animal welfare. Legislation. Grace boarded the aircraft with the same dignified calm she brought to every new experience. She explored her traveling quarters methodically, testing the custom bedding and investigating the specially installed observation windows. Within an hour of takeoff, she had settled into a routine that suggested she was treating the flight as simply another adventure in a life filled with extraordinary experiences. The reception at Heathrow Airport was unprecedented. British animal welfare organizations had organized what they called a parade of honor, lining the route from the airport to the temporary facilities where Grace would stay during her visit. Thousands of people gathered along the roadway, many holding signs thanking Grace for inspiring changes in animal protection laws across the United Kingdom. Windsor Castle had been prepared for Grace's arrival with the same attention to detail, typically reserved for visiting heads of state. A specially constructed pavilion in the castle's East Terrace garden provided accommodations that combined comfort with security. The Queen's own veterinary staff had consulted with Dr. Wells to ensure every aspect of Grace's care met the highest standards. The formal ceremony took place in the castle's Waterloo Chamber, a room typically reserved for state banquets and official receptions. Grace entered the historic hall wearing a ceremonial blanket woven with the emblems of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, her massive presence somehow perfectly suited to the grandeur of her surroundings. Queen Elizabeth II, despite her advanced age and failing health, insisted on presenting the award personally. At 96, Her Majesty had devoted much of her final years to animal welfare causes, and Grace's story had particularly captured her imagination. In a world too often defined by cruelty and indifference, the Queen said in her presentation speech, Grace represents the triumph of compassion over convenience, love over logic. She reminds us that dignity and worth are not determined by species or circumstance, but by the capacity for growth, connection, and service to others. The award itself was a crystal sculpture depicting the crown surrounded by representations of various animals, symbolizing the crown's commitment to protecting all creatures under its dominion. But the true significance lay in the precedent being established official recognition that individual animals could achieve status worthy of royal acknowledgement. Grace's response to the ceremony became the subject of international discussion. Rather than appearing overwhelmed by the grandeur of her surroundings, she seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. She stood perfectly still during the presentation, occasionally turning her head to acknowledge different sections of the assembled audience as if she were greeting subjects in her own kingdom. The 3-day visit to England included opportunities for Grace to interact with British animal welfare organizations, research institutions, and therapeutic facilities. At Great Ormond Street Hospital, she spent time with children facing serious illnesses, providing comfort and inspiration to young patients who had been following her story from around the world. Dr. Margaret Thornley, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, documented Grace's interactions with the children for future research into animal-assisted therapy. Grace demonstrated what we can only describe as intuitive medical assessment, Dr. Thornley observed. She seemed to recognize which children were in the most emotional distress and adjusted her behavior accordingly, offering gentle physical contact to some while maintaining respectful distance from others who needed space. The visit's most memorable moment occurred when Grace met Lady Buttercup, the Queen's Prize Aberdeen Angus cow and winner of multiple agricultural competitions. The meeting between two extraordinary cattle was documented by photographers and videographers, but what impressed observers most was the immediate recognition and respect the animals showed for each other. It was like watching two queens acknowledging each other's sovereignty, observed James Morrison, the Queen's head groundskeeper. Lady Buttercup has always been particular about other animals in her space, but she immediately deferred to Grace. There was an understanding between them that transcended normal cattle social dynamics. The international media coverage of Grace's royal visit reached an estimated audience of over 1 billion people worldwide. The image of a rescued cow receiving honors from the British Crown became a powerful symbol for animal rights movements across the globe. Legislation inspired by Grace's story was introduced in 17 countries during the weeks following her visit, but the trip's most significant impact was on Grace herself. The experience of traveling, meeting new animals and people, and being honored on such a grand scale seemed to awaken something new in her already remarkable consciousness. She returned to Wyoming with an expanded awareness of her role in the world and a new confidence in her ability to influence change. The transformation was immediately visible to everyone at the Broken Arrow. Grace began displaying leadership, behaviors that went beyond her previous role as herd matriarch. She started organizing the other cattle into what could only be described as educational groups, teaching younger animals complex social behaviors and problem-solving techniques that had never been documented in cattle populations. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who had returned to the ranch to study Grace's post-England behavior, was amazed by what she observed. Grace appears to be deliberately educating other cattle in advanced cognitive skills, Dr. Tanaka reported. She's creating a curriculum of consciousness, if you will, systematically raising the intellectual capacity of her entire community. Implications were staggering. If Grace could teach enhanced consciousness to other cattle, the possibilities for improving animal welfare extended far beyond individual rescue cases. Agricultural operations around the world began requesting consultation on implementing Grace protocols, management techniques designed to nurture intelligence and emotional development in livestock populations. The success of Grace's educational efforts was most evident in her own family. Hope, now 4 years old and pregnant with her third calf, had developed problem-solving abilities that surpassed even her mother's documented achievements. Faith, at 3, was demonstrating artistic expression that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal creativity and aesthetic appreciation, but it was the youngest generation that truly showcased Grace's teaching abilities. Faith's year-old calf, named Serenity, was displaying cognitive abilities at an age when most cattle were still developing basic motor skills. Serenity could distinguish between different humans by scent alone, respond to complex verbal commands, and demonstrate empathy toward distressed animals and humans that seemed almost supernatural in its accuracy. We're witnessing the emergence of a new subspecies, Dr. Martinez concluded after months of studying Grace's family dynamics. Grace hasn't just recovered from trauma, she's evolved beyond it, and she's passing that evolution on to successive generations. We may be looking at the beginning of a new chapter in bovine development. The scientific community's fascination with Grace's teaching abilities led to the establishment of the Grace Institute for Evolutionary Animal Psychology, a research facility dedicated to studying how consciousness and intelligence could be deliberately cultivated in animal populations. Universities around the world sent graduate students to study under Grace's tutelage, learning not just about animal behavior, but about the deeper principles of compassion and growth that she embodied. The Institute's research extended beyond cattle to include studies of enhanced consciousness in other species. Horses, sheep, pigs, and even chickens were showing remarkable improvements in cognitive ability when raised using Grace-inspired methods. The agricultural industry was beginning to recognize that treating animals as conscious individuals rather than production units could actually improve efficiency while enhancing welfare. Corporate partnerships brought both opportunities and challenges to the Broken Arrow Preserve. Major food companies sought to associate their brands with Grace's story, offering substantial financial support in exchange for endorsement opportunities. While Ezra was initially reluctant to commercialize Grace's image, he eventually agreed to partnerships that directly supported animal welfare research and rescue operations. The Grace Foundation, now managing an endowment of over $50 million, had become one of the world's largest supporters of animal consciousness research. Grants from the foundation supported rescue operations across 6 continents, funded veterinary schools specializing in trauma recovery, and provided resources for legislative advocacy in developing nations. But perhaps the foundation's most important work was the Grace Scholar Program, which provided full scholarships for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who demonstrated commitment to animal welfare. Emma Patterson had been the program's first recipient, and she was now completing her veterinary degree while conducting research on trauma recovery in large animals. "Grace taught me that healing is possible for everyone," Emma explained during her graduation speech at Colorado State University's veterinary school. "Not just the animals we treat, but the people who care for them. Every day I work to honor her lesson that love and patience can transform even the most hopeless situations into miracles." The ripple effects of Grace's influence continued to spread in unexpected directions. The entertainment industry had been transformed by her story, with major studios producing films and documentaries that emphasized animal consciousness and welfare. Children's literature featured characters inspired by Grace's journey from victim to victor. Even fashion designers were creating collections that celebrated the beauty and dignity of farm animals. Religious communities found meaning in Grace's story that transcended denominational boundaries. She was seen as a living example of redemption, forgiveness, and the power of love to overcome suffering. Pastoral care programs incorporated her story into counseling for people dealing with trauma and loss. Theological seminaries offered courses examining the spiritual implications of animal consciousness and the human responsibility to protect and nurture all creation. As spring returned to the Wyoming hills, Grace's domain had expanded to encompass nearly 100 acres of protected land. The preserve now included specialized facilities for research, education, and therapeutic programs. Visitors from around the world continued to make pilgrimages to see Grace, but the experience had evolved into something more structured and meaningful than simple tourism. The Broken Arrow had become a model for how human-animal relationships could be reimagined. Grace's example had proven that animals were capable of far more complex thoughts and emotions than previously understood. More importantly, she had demonstrated that humans were capable of growth and transformation when they opened their hearts to the possibility of genuine interspecies connection. Standing in Grace's pasture on a quiet evening, watching her supervise the play of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Ezra marveled at the improbable journey that had brought them all to this moment. The dying cow he had rescued from the auction yard had become a teacher whose lessons were reshaping humanity's understanding of consciousness, compassion, and the interconnectedness of all life. Grace had achieved something that no animal in history had accomplished. She had become a bridge between species, a translator of emotions that transcended the barriers between human and animal understanding. Her transformation from bleeding mother to sacred Empress was complete, but her influence continued to grow with each life she touched and each heart she opened to the possibility of love without boundaries. 10 years had passed since that fateful August day when Grace first arrived at the Broken Arrow Ranch, a decade of transformation, triumph, and transcendence that had rewritten the rules of what was possible between humans and animals. As Ezra stood at his kitchen window on this anniversary morning, watching Grace move through her domain with the measured grace of true royalty, he could barely recognize the desperate man who had impulsively bid on a dying cow at a county auction. Grace was now 12 years old, considered elderly for a Holstein, yet she carried herself with the vitality of an animal half her age. Her coat gleamed silver white in the morning sun, and her movements held the serene confidence of someone who had achieved everything they were meant to achieve. She was no longer just the sacred Empress of the Broken Arrow. She had become something approaching mythical, a living legend whose influence extended to every corner of the globe. The ranch itself had evolved into something unprecedented. Part sanctuary, part university, part pilgrimage site. The Grace Institute now attracted researchers from 53 countries, studying everything from interspecies communication to the hereditary nature of consciousness. Her bloodline had produced 17 offspring and 43 grandchildren, creating what scientists were calling the Grace lineage cattle, with demonstrably enhanced cognitive abilities and emotional intelligence. But on this quiet anniversary morning, all the accolades and recognition seemed secondary to a simple truth. Grace was home, surrounded by family, loved and protected for the rest of her natural life. The bleeding mother sold for whiskey money had become exactly what her rescue had promised, a creature whose worth was measured not in dollars or pounds, but in the immeasurable currency of lives touched and hearts transformed. The day's first visitor was someone Ezra hadn't expected to see again. Emma Patterson, now Dr. Emma Patterson, had returned from her deployment with Doctors Without Borders, where she'd been providing veterinary care in refugee camps across East Africa. At 23, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen suffering and learned to heal it. "I had to be here today," Emma explained as she approached Grace's pasture. "Everything I've accomplished, every animal I've saved, every person I've helped, it all started with meeting Grace when I was 10 years old." Grace remembered Emma, approaching the fence with the same gentle attention she'd shown that nervous child 13 years earlier. But Emma was no longer the girl seeking comfort for her grandmother's death. She was now a healer in her own right, carrying Grace's lessons to places where hope was scarce and miracles were desperately needed. "I used your story in the camps," Emma told Grace as she stroked the familiar forehead. "When people had lost everything and couldn't imagine healing was possible, I told them about a cow who was broken beyond repair, but found her way back to wholeness. Grace, you've been healing people on 3 continents, and you don't even know it." As the day progressed, a steady stream of visitors arrived for the anniversary celebration. Unlike the media circuses of previous years, this gathering felt more like a family reunion. The Grace Guard, now a formal organization with chapters in 37 states, had organized a quiet commemoration focused on reflection rather than spectacle. Dr. Martinez, now in her 70s, had made the journey from her retirement in Colorado to pay respects to the animal who had defined her late career research. "Grace taught me that science isn't just about observation and measurement," she reflected. "Sometimes the most important discoveries come from simply opening our hearts to possibilities we never imagined." Old Pete, now 89 and moving slowly but still sharp as a tack, sat in his lawn chair near Grace's fence, sharing stories with visitors about the early days of Grace's recovery. "People ask me what made Grace special," he said, his weathered hands gesturing toward the pasture. "Truth is, Grace wasn't special when she got here. She was just broken. What made her special was finding people who believed broken things could be fixed." Carlos, now the official ranch manager and Ezra's closest friend, had spent the morning ensuring everything was perfect for Grace's anniversary. At 53, he'd turned down multiple job offers from larger operations, choosing to remain at the Broken Arrow because, as he put it, some things matter more than money. As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Ezra found himself alone with Grace in the pasture, just as he had on countless nights over the past decade. The bronze medallion from the Heritage Foundation ceremony was still displayed in the visitor center, but it had been joined by honors from around the world: the Order of Agricultural Merit from France, the Cross of Animal Welfare from Germany, honorary doctorates from 12 universities, and recognition from organizations whose existence Grace had inspired. But the most meaningful tribute wasn't made of bronze or crystal. It was the letter that had arrived that morning from the Jimmy Crawdad Rehabilitation Center, a facility that Jimmy himself had established to help people struggling with addiction while learning to care for rescued animals. 5 years sober and completely transformed, Jimmy had become living proof that Grace's influence extended even to those who had wronged her. Grace, Ezra said quietly as they stood together in the gathering twilight. "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago." Grace turned her massive head to focus on him with those intelligent eyes that had guided so many of his decisions over the years. "I didn't save you," Ezra continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me. I was dying inside when I bought you, dying of loneliness, grief, and the terrible feeling that nothing I did mattered anymore. You gave me purpose. You taught me that love isn't just something you feel. It's something you do, every day, even when it's hard." Grace made her characteristic soft rumble, the sound that had become as familiar and comforting to Ezra as his own heartbeat. But there was something different about it tonight, a note of contentment and completion that seemed to acknowledge the truth of his words. As the stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, Ezra reflected on the improbable chain of events that had transformed his cattle ranch into a beacon of hope for the world. Grace had proven that individual animals could achieve consciousness and emotional intelligence that demanded respect and protection. She had inspired legislation, research, and cultural changes that would outlast her lifetime by generations. More importantly, she had demonstrated that healing was possible for anyone willing to believe in it. The bleeding mother sold for whiskey had become a sacred empress whose kingdom was built on love, sustained by compassion, and protected by the unshakable conviction that every life has infinite worth. Grace's legacy was secure. Her offspring carried her enhanced abilities into future generations. The Grace Institute would continue her educational mission long after she was gone. The foundation bearing her name would fund animal welfare work across the globe. The legislation inspired by her story would protect countless animals from the suffering she had endured. But perhaps her most important legacy was the simplest. She had taught the world that love could triumph over any obstacle, that patience could heal any wound, and that sometimes the most broken things became the most beautiful when someone refused to give up on them. Standing in that peaceful pasture under the star-filled Wyoming sky, Ezra understood that Grace had achieved something no animal in history had accomplished. She had transcended her species to become a teacher, a healer, and a symbol of hope for millions of people around the world. The widowed rancher who had bought a dying cow had discovered that sometimes salvation comes disguised as the thing that needs saving most. Grace had become exactly what her name implied, a living embodiment of divine favor, proof that miracles were possible for anyone willing to believe in them. She was, and would forever remain, the sacred empress whose reign over hearts and minds would continue long after her earthly kingdom had passed into legend. The transformation was complete. The story would live forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.